We are live. Shabbat Shalom, everybody. Good morning. It is so fabulous to be here with you. Missed you guys. Missed my dear colleagues. Missed David Beckman and Brian Lefsky helping to connect us. And most of all, missed learning with you. So thank you for joining us this morning. Let's first thank God for the gift of learning Torah together. Then I wanted to invite my beloved Chazan Elias to share a witty thought. And then we'll get right to it. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. V'harevna Adonai Eloheinu et divrei Toracha b'finu b'fi amcha beit Yisrael. ונהיה אנחנו וצאצאינו וצאצאי עמך בית ישראל. כולנו יודעי שמך ולומדי תורתך לשמה. ברוך אתה אדוני המלמד תורה לעמו ישראל. ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם אשר בחר בנו מכל העמים ונתן לנו את תורתו. ברוך אתה אדוני נותן התורה. So Shabbat Shalom, good morning. And Elias, you're on, my friend.
Yeah, so it seems like we've been very popular with our class. So just to mention a vignette, the other day I went to see my doctor for the annual checkup, and instead of saying hello to me, how are you doing, Elias? How are you doing, Cantor? He says, where are your new shoes? It's like, we have been very popular. But, many of us wake up in the morning and we are thankful for so many things. And I'm thankful for my job, for my health, for my family, for coming here to sing at Temple Emmanuel. It's wonderful. But today was the day. So I'm wearing the same shirt that I wore for Mikey's bar mitzvah, and it still fits. So I want to show my neck.
It's not that long ago.
You see? There's still room here. So very happy for that.
Well,
so thank you. That made my day.
Thank you, Elias. So
I hope that was inspiring.
That's a nice bit of light touch, because our subject today is the opposite of a light touch, so we appreciate your light touch. So look, obviously, the big news since we were last together was the insurrection on January 6th. And obviously, if we're going to be relevant to our world, we have to talk about the insurrection. And if we're not going to be relevant to the world, why would we even be here? So we have to talk about the insurrection. And here's I wanted to ask kind of two questions this morning. First one is, why at the human level? What's the human story of somebody who would choose to go to the insurrection on January 6th? That is to say, I just state the obvious, this is not about I like this candidate or that candidate. That was decided in November, and all the challenges were resolved by 50 to 60 courts and the Supreme Court and the Attorney General, who said there was no fraud, and the Director of Cybersecurity said it was the most secure election in U.S. history, and the Electoral College, which gave its decision. So all that was decided. There was no more issue of maybe there was fraud. All the institutions of American democracy weighed in on that and said there was none. So given all that, what would inspire somebody, motivate somebody, cause somebody in the middle of COVID, when cases are surging, and we all know how dangerous it is to get on a plane? To get on a plane, to come with firearms, to come with handcuffs, to come with military gear and military attire to the nation's capital, and then to storm the seat of our democracy. At the human level, why would somebody do that? So I wanted to bring, that's one question. And the second question is, what can we at Temple Emmanuel, 385 Ward Street, what can we do to be helpful to our country in this moment? So to get at this, I wanted to bring together three different sources. The first one is a story about Cleet Keller, who was an Olympic swimmer, gold medalist. He won 2 gold medals. He won 5 medals overall in 2 different Olympics. And he seemed to be a perfect candidate for happily ever after. But this past week, he was arrested by federal authorities and charged with federal offenses because he was at the insurrection. That's the first thing. Second thing is, I wanted to get you a piece of wisdom that could be read by all. And I'm, of course, mindful of the challenging political divide that is in America and is in our community. So I wanted something that could be read by everybody, that wasn't CNN or wasn't Fox News, that wasn't the Wall Street Journal, wasn't the Washington Post. And what I found was, and I was thinking about it, I remember when I was 19 years old in college, 40 years ago, I read an article called The Paranoid Style in American Politics by Richard Hofstadter. And Hofstadter was one of the great historians of American history. And he wrote this piece. It's obviously not about our personalities or our politics or any of the presidential candidates today, because he wrote this in the 1960s. And I wanted to bring that to bear. And then finally, the third thing is, so we have a story, we have an essay, a classic essay in American history writing. And then the third one is the prayer that Barry Black uttered after the Senate and the House, after Congress certified and confirmed the Electoral College result. Barry Black spoke at about 3:48 in the morning, and that was, if you happen to be watching it, Shira and I were watching it, was quite a stunning moment. And wanted to see if that is going to be helpful. So we'll start with the story. And if you haven't read the story, I know not everybody gets a chance to read the story, so here's the story in brief. Clete Keller is 6'6". The Lord has blessed him with every advantage. He's athletic, he's tall, he's muscular, he's handsome. He's a world-class swimmer, and he achieves the pinnacle of fame and glory. In 2004, he is the anchor swimmer on Michael Phelps' relay team. He's going up against Ian Thorpe from Australia, at the time the world's greatest swimmer. Nobody thought anybody would win except for Ian Thorpe. And Clete Keller beats Ian Thorpe, and USA wins gold. And he'll go on again to win another gold and 3 other medals. And if you followed the podcast, which is so fascinating, he comes back home, and instead of living happily ever after, he does get married and does have kids, but he finds real life pales in comparison. There's nothing that's quite gets his juices flowing as much as swimming. Doesn't like his job, gets disgruntled, brings that disgruntlement, that negative energy home, and on the same fateful day, he loses his job. His wife kicks him out of the house. I want a divorce. He lives in his car for 10 months. He reaches out to his estranged sister in desperation. She lives actually in the Washington, D.C., Maryland area, ironically, and he says to her, I'm homeless, I'm living in my car for 10 months. I know we've been estranged. She says, come on over. And he borrows $100 and gets the gas money to drive to her house. And he stays with her, and she restores him, and she takes him in, and she brings him back. And the podcast ends with him saying, you know, I'm ready to live again. I've won the gold medal. I've been homeless. I'm ready to win here. I'm going to go to this real estate firm in Colorado. I'm going to reinvest in real estate sales. I'm going to be a successful, productive, adult human being. I'm not going to let my Olympics define me. And if you read the Wikipedia page, and if you read the New York Times article, once it was, we don't know what happens, hence the conversation, why he goes from that resolve post his sister to the insurrection. But as a result of he's 6'6", he's very handsome and distinct looking, plus he's wearing a USA Today swim jacket. So literally the whole world can identify him. He's arrested, he's charged, and he's fired. And the company that he was going to work at in Colorado Springs took him off their website. He's done. Okay. So here's I want to just invoke the spirit of William Blake through a grain of sand. You can see the universe. I want to talk about two things, two universes. First, the human condition. What do we learn from Clete Keller's story about life, about the human condition? Put aside politics and all this horrible toxic stuff we're all dealing with, but just about life, about happiness, about human condition, about how it feels to get up in the morning and how you feel about your day. What do we learn from Clete Keller's story about that? And then second layer is, what does that teach us about why he might have been drawn to the insurrection? So, dear colleagues, the floor is yours. First question, what does Clete Keller's story teach us about life? Dan Nessen.
I think the first thing to think about is that we have to reinvent ourselves every day. You're a world-class athlete, you're a world-class singer, whatever, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't mean all these people here. It doesn't mean that the next day you're going to be there. You have to reinvent yourself. You have to be proactive about who you are every day. That's one thing. I think also that, as you mentioned, that part of the human condition, I think part of it is that some of us just just have something within our psychology that says we need to fail. Some people they just need to fail, and whether it's a failure that's as dramatic as the swimmer or not, some people, no matter how successful they are, something in their psychology, something in their upbringing, just creates a sense of not a complete sense of worth, and that failure is the only option for them. I think that's just part of the human. With some people, part of the human condition.
So Dan, I hear you making two different points, which are in some little creative tension with one another. One is that we need meaning and purpose every day.
Mm-hmm.
None of us can live on yesterday's glory. Certainly none of us can live on the glory that we accomplished in 2004. That's so 2004. We need to wake up on January 16th, 2021. We need to wake up on January 17th, 2021. We need to wake up every single day and find meaning and purpose in that day, in today, in the present, right? And not on what we did, years ago, okay? Right. And in fact, the corollary of that is that if we had a super accomplished past, but a super anemic present, then we're kind of haunted by our past,
right.
In a way that's not very helpful. And the second thing is that we have a tendency towards, many of us do, we have to resist it, self-destruction. Right. How do we not become our own worst enemy? Right. Okay, good start off. Elias, and then Elisa.
Yeah, so I have to say, first of all, what happened to this guy, Clit, it's very sad. I'm talking about the aftermath of his successful career, not anything that happened in the politics. It's not unusual. I've seen countless of stories like that of especially elite sport people who struggle with the aftermath. Think about ourselves, or think about anybody who is a temple member. Most of us study, in our 20s, and then in the 30s, we, maybe before we start, with a wonderful, if we are lucky enough, wonderful career, and we aim to be successful. But then we have decades of that, God willing, good health. This is the opposite. They train very intensely with a lot of pressure, and then they have maybe 5-10 years of their prime, and that's it. And you are 30, 35, you're a healthy young person, and your past is, your best years are gone. So it's not unusual. That being said, it shows, how different and how fragile human beings are in terms of our own self-esteem and how do we see ourselves in the world. And then, yeah, so pretty much it.
By the way, just I'm letting a question hang, dangle, marinate question, which is absolutely it is true that, pretty much every athlete, 100% of athletes have their best years when they're in their late teens and 20s and 30s. There's the occasional LeBron and the occasional Tom Brady, but most people top out in their 30s, mid-30s. And then by the time they're 40, 42, 43, their best athletic years are behind them. But not all of those, in fact, to our knowledge, only one of them, ended up at the insurrection. So one of the questions is, what was it that caused him to go so deeply south so quickly? Elisa, your thoughts?
Well, it's interesting. I remember, Michelle, you gave a gorgeous sermon about Michael Phelps and his journey really into the depths of depression. And for him, it was much less socially destructive and much more internally destructive, that transition. And for him, it wasn't even completely out of swimming. But I think that for me, this is so illustrative of the challenge of tunnel vision, that we, particularly athletes, right, and particularly, I think also swimming, like when you think about swimming, you're by yourself in the water. There's no one around you. You're solely focused on your time. Like you might have a relay match, but you don't actually see your teammates until you're out of the water. And everything is intensely pressureful, and you're not connected to a larger group. There's your physical being, and that's it, and that's all that matters. And I could imagine it's a hard transition to come out of. Now, I think this also speaks to, right, how are we Cleat Keller? I think that particularly in this pandemic, it's so easy to feel like you're in that tunnel, like you're all alone, like you're just fighting the fight and there's no one around you. And what I think, what I saw, you know, in addition to the violence, in addition to the intensity of the mob, what I saw was a community of people larger than one person who are all together, who are all fighting this one thing, who it's a larger mission. It's like you can be a part of a team. And I think that that has, in the same way that we find meaning in religious communities and in the same way we find a sense of purpose, right? How do non-Olympic athletes find their ability to transcend physical failure through the ages? It's by meaning and purpose. It's by planting the seeds of your legacy in future generations. It's by continuing to nourish something more than yourself. And so this was someone who personal life seemed a little bit self-destruct, and now he's like, where do I find meaning and greater purpose and greater connection?
Yeah, so but Michelle, before I turn to you, I just want to kind of pivot from your comment, Eliza, to the political question, which is how does this guy, you know, who had the highest heights and now the lowest lows, now go even lower? Now he's not only homeless, now he's, you know, charged by federal authorities. And I had read an article, we've all read 1,000 articles about the events of our country. One was from a Boston Globe person who talked about 3 N's, 3 words that begin with N. I forget the first one, but the second and the third were narrative and network. Narrative and network. And what I hear you saying is that he's drawn to a narrative that's beyond, I used to be an Olympic athlete, right? I used to be somebody, I used to be an athlete, and here's a narrative of take back the country. And he's looking for a network. Hey, there's like, you know, thousands of people who are looking to take back our country. So I get network, I get narrative, it's no longer just me. Michelle.
So I find the question challenging because there is a piece of me that feels like responding to you that the human soul is completely inscrutable, and our layered meaning that we put on top of other people's actions is always impressionistic. We actually cannot know what was happening for him or for anybody else who was there or anyone else who was here, or why does anyone do the things that they do in the world. We can come up with lots of theories, we can come up with long articles, but it's always a judgment that we're bringing into the situation. And to me, I feel like, you know, Lisa, I think there's a piece of what you said that is so true, just fundamentally, that when you don't have a community, when you don't have a purpose, a greater purpose beyond yourself, many people are adrift. Was that the case with him? I couldn't begin to judge, but I am grateful to you, Dan, for starting the conversation with the idea of the need for daily meaning, which I think is really important, not only for anyone who was at the Capitol, but for each of us. My favorite prayer is B'chol et erev voker v'tzohoraim, and every moment there is a miracle, a possibility of something that we can see. And I think looking for that, you know, we frame it as losing that, but it may be actually looking for that that draws action of people who feel politically charged as well.
So let's put Clete Keller's story and January 6th in the larger context that Richard Hofstadter does for us. So if you haven't read the article yet, I do recommend it. It's just a thoughtful piece wherever you are in today's world. It's a thoughtful piece. Here's what he argues. And again, he writes this in the 1960s. For him, the context was 2 things. One, the McCarthy era, and the second, Barry Goldwater. And here's what he says. He says that there has always been in the history of America a very strong minority of American citizens who are angry and who have violent tendencies and who are given to conspiratorial thinking. And because he's the world's best historian at the time, he gives you different centuries. He slices and dices, you know, the Masons and this one, the Illuminists, the Masons, all different contexts where there's an angry minority of American citizens who spin conspiracy theories, and that is Richard Hofstadter's words in the 60s, conspiracy theories about how the America that they love is gone and we need to get America back. and this was in the 17th century, the 18th century. The America that we love is gone, and there's bad people who are taking our country away from us, and that makes them angry, and they live their conspiracy, and they live their conspiracy with violence. So I just want to read the last two, kind of the close of this, so you get a sense of it. He talks about that they are double sufferers because they suffer at one level from the world that is, and they suffer at a second level, the double sufferer, because of the pull of their conspiratorial fantasies. He writes, the megalomaniac view of oneself as the elect, wholly good, abominably persecuted, yet assured of ultimate triumph, the attribution of gigantic and demonic powers to the adversary, the refusal to accept the ineluctable limitations and imperfections of human existence, such as transience, dissension, conflict, fallibility, whether intellectual or moral, the obsession with inerrable prophecies, systemized misinterpretations, always gross and often grotesque. And he's writing that in the 60s, and then he writes, so prophetically, he writes about the possibility of violence. Certain religious, so that angry, conspiratorial, paranoid style, as he uses, to use his term, the paranoid style, always exists, but certain religious traditions, certain social structures, and national inheritances, certain historical catastrophes or frustrations may be conducive to the release of such psychic energies and to situations in which they can more readily be built into mass movements or political parties. In American experience, ethnic and religious conflict have plainly been a major focus for militant and suspicious minds of this sort, but class conflicts also can mobilize such energies. And his essay ends, if you haven't read it, with just the diagnosis that there is, it's just part of our DNA as an American citizens, angry, minority, conspiratorial, the world's against us, I need to get my America back, and we're gonna fight to do that. And that's always there, and then there are certain times and places where that energy is released. That paranoid style. So, question, dear colleagues, how does his thinking about paranoid style intersect with January 6th, and how does it intersect with Cleet Keller? Elias?
Yeah, we would like to hear your opinion once in a while.
I'll give it to you, don't worry. No worries.
So
But
I want to exercise a little bit of humility here as we approach this article, because I'm mindful of where we are in our Torah right now, which is there is all evil in Pharaoh, and we are, the right and the just lahavdil, right? It's not a violent insurrection, but plenty of violence goes on happening, for which, for most of our history, we're pretty pleased about. You look back at our Torah, it's something like Korach, right? We absolutely can name this phenomenon within our very own tradition, and the only difference is that we're right. In the end, we feel like we're right, we're just, we serve a higher purpose and a higher power, but there have been many movements throughout history who have gone the other way, and those who were impassioned by their values, by their what you called prophetic values, won the day, and then either tempered or did not temper over time, and they're the ones who write their stories. So I think this is an incredibly important descriptive article, but it also is something that we need to be mindful of in the roots of every tradition. Any tradition has the possibility to inspire that kind of pathos.
Elise, I know, because we talked about this essay during the week, it really connected with you. Tell us why.
I'm a little bit obsessed with this essay. It feels, first off, as I was reading it, I couldn't believe that this was written 40 years ago, that this is, it feels like it's speaking directly to this moment and to the kind of language that we're using in this moment, which is not measured, is not about, right? We've seen the ways in which politicians particularly are punished for appearing to be reserved or taking time to reflect and not just immediately moving to action, that rather than rewarding a culture of thoughtful discussion, we reward memes and we reward this kind of paranoid thought. And it's so paradoxical because this country was founded on the basis of free speech and ideas and on the ability to share those ideas and the idea that when you have open communication, open lines of communication, you're able to have a more full, thoughtful process. And what has evolved is actually the opposite of that, that in some ways the paranoid thinking and in some ways the lack of thoughtful reflection is as censoring as would be a policy that wouldn't allow people to speak. I read this article. I had a further conversation with my mom about it around the ways in which paranoid thinking and paranoid speech colors our country. And my mom has an expertise in cult and mind control. And she said this is a classic mind control. It's not, paranoid thought in some ways feels like, oh my gosh, this is too much. But she feels like it's actually not enough. That what we should see is that the kinds of conversations that are happening in our country are designed to make us feel like we are pitted against evil and it's up to us to stand up against it. And that paired with love bombing and the reward centers of our brains, that when you get involved with these alt-right organizations, they're communities and they're happy for you and they love you and they support you and they want you to be built up. Plus you have to fight against evil, creates a space where people are not using their brains, and that's terrifying.
And one of the things that your comment, quoting your mom, Wendy, points to is that while much of our world is not new, and Richard Hofstadter describes it very fairly, in my view, in the 60s about paranoid thinking, et cetera, the anger, the conspiracy, et cetera. What is new is the social media that are an accelerant and an amplifier of social media, of conspiratorial thinking, and the echo chambers that we all live in. Everyone lives in their own echo chambers, and therefore, if you tend to be, to fall into the kind of group that Hofstadter is describing, angry, conspiratorial, I got to get my country back, et cetera, then you surround yourself with this whole love-bombing echo chamber of people who feel the same way. And then the whole idea of a democracy and dialogue where we talk to each other doesn't have a social media takes what Hofstadter describes and amplifies it and enhances it and makes it dramatically more difficult. Elias.
Now, I want to say a couple of things here. I've seen my whole life growing up in Argentina what violence can bring. Jokingly, I was telling Michelle the other day that, many afternoons when I was a teenager with my parents and my brother, we would sit down and bring some croissants and beautiful stuff, to eat. And we say, hey, let's watch TV. Who is taking hostage who today? Let's see, So those were things that were normal for me growing up. Attacks and violence. It's horrible. It's horrible. And I agree with you that dialogue is the only way of doing stuff, okay? So, that being said, I have to say that I don't feel that comfortable with this article thinking that we are talking about a minority here, okay? I think that there are millions of people in this country that think that way, so it's not a minority. I don't feel comfortable in that way, regardless of my own political opinions, okay? I don't feel that way. I also feel that we live in an alternative reality because on my own case, Facebook feeds, I see people who don't think like me and I say, oh, this guy is crazy. And the 10th time that I see that, I just block him or her. So we are also in an alternative reality. It's not good and bad or majority and minority. It's two sides of the coin that are fighting for what each one considers being the truth.
Right. Okay, so...
Okay? So, for example, I need to bring some humor, you know me here.
Yes.
So, for example, you call this class Talmud class, but there is nothing of Talmud in this class, all right? So that's an alternative reality. So suppose that Alisa is your vice president. Alisa is your vice president. And then there is a mob outside saying, Alisa, you have to stand with us. Wes is taking this synagogue down. He calls it Talmud class. There is zero Talmud content. You have to stand up. You have to stand up what is right. And Michelle and I are the leaders, and then are the leaders of the other, the alternative reality. And we, right. I mean, no reference to you being the vice president. I'm not saying anything related with the politics. You know, this is nothing to do with reality.
And your
Anyways,
point is,
my point is that there are so many people that don't think that this is a Talmud class. And it's not a minority, perhaps the majority. I go to play tennis, hey, Cantor, in the middle of a game. Why do you guys call it Talmud class? There is nothing of Talmud in this class, in a tennis match. Anyways, so, you know, we have to be careful when we say alternative, not alternative, but when we say minority and yeah, I don't know, that's how I feel.
okay, so where we are in the conversation is, I mean, you could, where we are in the conversation is that you could call it, I mean, whether you call it a minority or not, there's a lot of Americans who think this way. I mean, thousands upon thousands were on the Capitol grounds, you know, we're in the mall, and then and many did the insurrection, and we know that, you know, 81 million voted for one candidate, 72 million voted for another candidate. So there's a lot of people, and I don't want to fight about the nouns, but the larger point is that these two groups, and particularly the part of the 72 million that were warm towards supportive of the insurrection, who think the insurrection is a good idea. By the way, I mean, and the more you read about this, the scarier it gets. I was hearing a police officer who was on the grounds who said that the mob of rioters said, kill him with his own gun. Kill him with his own gun. And so you're talking about people who want, you know, kill him with his own gun, and if you ask them, what are you doing, they would say, we're patriots. We are patriots. We are taking our country back. We're going to kill him with his own gun. That's going to take our country back. And however many people there are, and you pick your noun, I think that's a minority. It's an angry minority, but pick your noun. The point is, it's hard to dialogue with that. It's hard to dialogue with kill him with your own gun. And you crack down on it and you throw those people in jail, but you still have a worldviews that are in great conflict. So here's the next question that I want to bring to us, which is Hofstadter's article ends with a diagnosis but no prescription. I mean, when his article ends, there's just this violent, what he calls a violent and conspiratorial minority, and he prophetically points out that there are going to be circumstances which release this psychic energy into our country, which is obviously what happened. And he doesn't even ask, let alone answer, what do we do about it? But we're a shul. So I wanted to take a look at this prayer of Barry Black. And Michelle, would you mind just reading for us Barry Black's prayer? And the question that I ask you is it a helpful prayer? And what does it call upon us to do? And how does this prayer intersect with Cleet Keller? How does this prayer intersect with Cleet Keller?
Lord of our lives and sovereign of our beloved nation, we deplore the desecration of the United States Capitol building, the shedding of innocent blood, the loss of life, and the quagmire of dysfunction that threaten our democracy. These tragedies have reminded us that words matter and that the power of life and death is in the tongue. We have been warned that eternal vigilance continues to be freedom's price. Lord, you have helped us remember that we need to see in each other a common humanity that reflects your image. You have strengthened our resolve to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, domestic as well as foreign. Use us to bring healing and unity to our hurting and divided nation and world. Thank you for what you have blessed our lawmakers to accomplish in spite of threats to liberty. Bless us and keep us. Drive far from us all wrong desires. Incline our hearts to do your will and guide our feet on the path of peace. And God bless America. We pray in your sovereign name. Amen.
Okay. Guys, we're in the prayer business. I mean, that's what we do. We pray and teach prayer and pray with people. Do you like this prayer? What's your response to this prayer? And remember, prayer is always situational. This prayer is delivered at 3:48 a.m. after the end of a historically traumatizing day. And the context is the insurrection in the morning and then the vote to certify the Electoral College outcome at 3:47. Barry Black comes, offers this prayer. What do you think of this prayer?
Yeah, I don't love it because, as you say, it is very situational, and it's also, it's also very political. it's clearly saying that one side is correct, and and the other side is not. I mean, what we're talking about the whole time is that we have a divided. We've always had a divided world in which people's realities are different. Our reality, many people's reality is one thing, and as Hofstadter points out, what he calls the conspiratorial, paranoid reality is their reality, and it's the reality, as we just talked about, that it creates for millions of people a sense of connection and community. So this prayer is basically saying that the people that are on one side are wrong and the other side is correct, and that's why I really don't love it. I don't find it a unifying prayer.
Can I ask a question
they
about
are
that?
wrong to storm the Capitol. Like this feels in some ways like, after the Charlotte rally, Trump was like, there are good people on both sides. Like there's a challenge, because you do have to say they were wrong. 5 people were killed because they were wrong. There is a right here, and it's okay to have division, but not the actions that they took.
Dan, what's the right prayer for somebody who says, kill the policeman with his own gun? What prayer would you offer for that? Kill him with his own gun. And I'm a patriot, by the way. What's your prayer?
Okay, for the person that said that.
Yeah. Do you not call that out as wrong?
I do call it as wrong. Yeah, I do. Right.
Can I say something?
Yeah.
Yes, please.
Yeah.
So I agree with all of you. Not with you. I'm sorry. Yes, Lord Mason, I'm sorry. But I have a question for all of you. So, 100% sure, we have to denounce this, and this is doing it. But you give this prayer to whoever did the attack. Is this prayer going to change them?
Yeah, I actually want to pick up exactly with that, because this prayer, which is just tremendously artful in being extraordinary. I mean, as a rabbi, I have deep admiration for this prayer and its ability to be incredibly pointed in a sort of gentle and reasonable way.
Very Michelle Robinson,
That
by the way.
So I thank you.
Gentle with the point.
Wait, I thought you wrote it.
But
I thought you wrote it, Michelle.
But keep going.
Mother
I
Teresa
digress.
Michelle Robinson.
I interrupt you. You were saying.
But it has a really fundamental tension in here that I think we struggle with as a society in general, which is exactly what you're calling out. There are some things that are beyond the bounds of our conversation and beyond the bonds of healing. And I always struggle with this, because I'm a person who believes very strongly that if we can only talk to each other, if we can only engage each other, if we can only role model in the world of the right way to live, that eventually, just minds, but bring healing and unity to our hurting and divided nation, and the idea of, may we see in each other a common humanity which reflects our image. Each of these statements are sort of, they're so grand and so beautiful, and I think they run into the challenge of, are the people who are hearing this, to your point with Dan, are the people who are hearing this, the people who were on the Capitol, who were saying they were patriots and kill him with their own gun, is this a possible dream for us, or is the Korach story kind of the right story as a template for a nation? Do we need at some point to say we have to excise the Korach instinct from our ranks?
Yeah, so Michelle, that's just so interesting.
So weird. So you are bringing some Judaism into this Talmud class that is not
Sorry.
a Talmud class. That is not a Talmud class.
Okay, so Michelle, I think that's a really helpful contribution, because what I hear in that is a creative tension between the person who articulated this prayer most beautifully, most memorably, and most famously in American history is Abraham Lincoln. Charity towards all and malice towards none, right? Charity towards all, malice towards none. That's what President Lincoln was saying, and in fact, in Doris Kearns Goodwin's book, Leadership in Tumultuous Times, on his last day, the last day of his life, which was a good day, they had won the war, the Civil War was over, and Lincoln was described by Goodwin as being in a very good mood, because Ulysses Grant, his general, was inclined to do charity towards all and malice towards none. And his team of rivals, all the different rivals, charity towards all, malice towards none. We want to bring you all in. And then the reality is that how did that end? Not too well. I mean, we had Reconstruction for 12 years, and then Jim Crow, and then lynchings, and more lynchings, and more lynchings, and more lynchings. So the question is, so you have the Lincoln approach, which is trying to do what Dan is talking about, as well as it could be humanly done, which results in lynchings in the end. Or you have the Korach result, which is you excise people and you throw them in and burn them in the ground. The problem is that's not very good public policy. It's a good biblical. It's a good Bible story, and God gets to do it because God is God, and the Torah is written from God's point of view. But we humans don't get to do that. We don't get to do that. And so that option, even if you love Korach and you think that's the cleaner option, that all the people who say, well, kill him with his own gun, God is going to smite them the way that God and the Torah does, or the Old Testament, as our Christian friends would say, does. We can't do that. We don't do that, right?
But that's the tension of this
Right.
prayer right here, because you have these dueling
Right.
instincts
But here's,
coming to play right
I want to
within
come
it.
back to Cleet Keller, and then I'm going to answer Elias's question about what do I think. With regard to Cleet Keller, here's how I think this intersects with Temple Emmanuel at 385 Ward Street. Cleet Keller, again, and mindful, Michelle, of what you point out, how does anybody know another soul? Even souls don't know their own souls. Souls don't know their own souls. We're a mystery to ourselves, so surely other people are a mystery to us. Given that's obviously true, still we have to make do in the world. It does seem like he's missing meaning, and it does seem like he's missing connection and community. And it seems to me that religious communities could create a helpful solution here of helping people. The question is, when you wake up on January 16th, 2021, how do I live a life of meaning and connection? I think synagogue communities, mosque communities, church communities, religious communities, communities of faith can be very helpful. They don't have to be helpful. Religious communities contain multitudes, and they can also be terrible. But they can be helpful at helping their adherents wake up in the morning and create meaning and connection today. And let's say that, Cleet Keller had more meaning and had more connection. Maybe he would have found his narrative and his network not in an insurrection. Maybe he would have found it at church or at a mosque or at a synagogue. Elias, you ask, what do I think? So I want to end with the following little mini devar, which is that in Va'era this morning, we encounter the plagues of Dam Tzfardea Kinim. The Nile gets bloody, and then you got a lot of frogs, and then you got a lot of insect infestation, vermin, okay? So I want to talk about that, which is the power of momentum for a society. And if you read the 10 plagues, you see that there's momentum. One plague leads ineluctably to the next. So in other words, if frogs are hanging out in the Nile, but the Nile is not habitable anymore, it's not hospitable to frog life because it's bloody, those frogs leave, okay? One plague leads to the next. The frogs end up dying, and the Torah says there are heaps and heaps of them. The Torah has some colorful language, heaps and heaps, and they stink, they stench. Okay, they're a huge stench, okay? And then once they decompose, guess what? Lots of insects, okay? And you read about, so there's momentum, negative momentum. And as you read the plagues 4 through 10, what happens is the Egyptians say, hey, Pharaoh, we're begging you, let them go. The Egyptians themselves say, let them go. Can we course correct Pharaoh? Can we course correct Pharaoh? But in an authoritarian society, when you have an authoritarian regime, there's no potential for self-correction. And so it ends with the 10th plague and every family is stricken. We see the power of negative momentum in our democracy today. We have the health crisis, which leads to the economic crisis, which leads to the deepening of the social crisis. Black and brown communities are adversely affected disproportionately, both in terms of health outcomes and economic outcomes. That creates and deepens even the rift among the American citizens. And then, of course, all of that deepens political crisis. So you have negative momentum. What's different about an authoritarian regime from a democracy, authoritarian regimes cannot self-correct. But in a democracy, you can have a vote where society says we want a fresh start. We're both Martin Luther King Shabbos, and we're at the Shabbos of pivot point, of junction point, of the end of the old administration and the beginning of the new administration. And our prayer is that our democracy will self-correct and will have a whole new momentum, and that we'll be able to get a fresh start. But as Richard Hofstadter points out, every day we need to renew the struggle to create a good day for our beloved country. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom,
Shabbat
everyone.
shalom.